Okay, so this is my studio. I've got a couple of paintings selected for you to see that I'm working on right now. One is about, I think it's about 6 by 4.5 feet over here. The other one is about 4 by 2. I've been working on both of them for about 1.5 years, on and off. The third small one is one that I've just brought out because I felt like looking at it, and I might work on it again. Okay, so today's mission is to go over some of the colors that I use and to talk about the brushes, the many brushes that are available to us and the different properties that they have. I'll first introduce you to my palette. So this is a sheet of about 1/4 inch thick glass that I use. Underneath it is a thick piece of styrofoam, just so it doesn't, I find the styrofoam gives it some grip so it's not sliding around. So this way I'm able to kind of scrape it off and move along. If I let paint dry on it for too long, it's easy to clean off. The white underneath gives me a good sense of what's happening in terms of color and transparency and that sort of thing. So you notice my mix of colors. The paint I use is a mix of Stevenson, which is unfortunately closed their paint factory. So Stevenson, Winsor Newton, the artist quality Winsor Newton, and I have a few Old Holland paints as well, and some specialty pigments from Cama, a company out of Montreal. I recommend, you know, as you get out of school and start making hopefully more money, moving into buying professional quality paint. Using the cheaper paints, you kind of get what you pay for with paint, in terms of the predictability of the results, and the quality of the colors that you're going to get, the purity of the colors you're going to get. Moving into professional quality paint is a good idea. I'm just putting out my, as you can see, I've been collecting a lot of varieties of tubes of paint. Over the years, you get to know what colors you're most compatible with, the color, and you change like that. Colors that I was comfortable with and I used a lot, you know, 20 years ago, I've kind of moved away from for one reason or another. I meant to organize this, but we had some technical glitches to start out, so I wasn't able to. Sorry about that. Okay. I use this to open some jars that have become stubborn. Okay. There we go. So I'm going to spread out a variety of colors for you to look at. Some of these I know I've talked about in class, but I think some reminders would be a good idea. Let's start with the whites. So this is titanium white. Titanium white's sort of the basic go-to for most painters. It's an opaque white, so it's strong. When mixing it with other colors, it sort of gives more of a pastel appearance. Tends to cool the colors off, move them towards like a bluish tint. And the next one beside that is a Zinc White. Zinc White is a little bit more translucent. It's not as strong as Titanium White. And it's good for mixing. So if you want to create sort of a cloudy version of a color, you can use Zinc White to kind of spread over in a thin layer to kind of create a veil. It's really good for mixing with colors if you want a more intense lighter version of that color. Okay, I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so yellows. I use 3 yellows primarily. They're all cadmiums. Where's my? Oh, there we go. So I've got cadmium yellow middle, cadmium yellow light, cadmium yellow lemon. Cadmium yellow middle is a deeper kind of yellow. It's more on the opaque side of things, so not as good for glazing. Good for sort of a direct paint application. This is cadmium yellow light, which is a cooler yellow, moving on sort of towards green. And cadmium yellow lemon, which is really close. I don't know if they even would show up as different on screen, but the cadmium yellow lemon's a little bit brighter than the cadmium yellow light, and it's a little bit even more on the cool side of yellow, so more towards a green tint. Oranges. So with my oranges, cadmium orange, and I use I found this Windsor Orange. It's a more of a translucent orange. So cadmium orange is opaque. It's a very strong color. Something to note is these are all pure pigments, so they're not, when you buy student quality like this old stuff, like the Winton brand, often you'll find the cheaper paint is cadmium orange hue. That means it's a mix of a few different pigments. So you're not getting as strong as pure color. So once you start to mix it, it'll kind of deaden on you a little bit more. So cadmium orange, like a pure cadmium orange, those pure hues maintain their vibrancy even after mixing. They don't get as muddy, and they're just brighter and more intense in the painting. So beside that is the Windsor Orange. This is more of a translucent orange, better for glazing. Oh, yellow I forgot. Indian yellow. We've talked about this in class. Indian yellow is very translucent, beautiful for glazing. Mixing with white, you get a very intense sort of sunshine yellow. You can mix it with greens to warm them up. Really flexible color. I use Indian yellow a lot in most of my paintings. You'll find that. Just to sort of talk about some of how those yellows are applied. So this is basically a pure cadmium yellow applied over. You can maybe see hints of underpainting there. So that's a bright, strong, almost like a pure, balanced yellow. Beside that, you've got a bit of the cadmium yellow light, and lemon is kind of over here. So I mix and match those yellows depending on how warm or how cool a yellow I want. Let's move on to reds. So my favorite, I think probably my favorite color, the one that I use a lot, is Cadmium Red Light. Again, this is an opaque. All of your cadmiums typically will kind of move towards an opaque. Not as good for glazing. This is Cadmium Red Middle. Ooh, that's an oily tube. So these are both opaque reds, not great for glazing. Red that I like for glazing is Windsor Red. So it's more translucent. And Permanent Rose is another good glazing red, or Permanent Carmine. They're similar, kind of more on the purple side of red. I'll go with the Carmine for today. So that's close to a crimson red, which I don't think I have a crimson right now. I've been using those two instead of crimson, but crimson is quite close. Specialty pigments, Cama Pigments Iridescent Pink. I've been using that color too much probably, but I love it. So I use the iridescent pink in sort of these little sections here. I often mix it with orange to make it a little bit more intense, kind of in here. You can even, well, I've been just experimenting to see what it can do lately because it's new to my palette. And I'm loving the results. So that's the warm side of the spectrum, from whites to yellows, oranges, and reds. I've got an empty canvas. Let's do some stuff on that, just so you get a sense of what the brush strokes will look like. Okay. So my favorite brand of brushes is Skoda. You'll see a lot of these sort of tan brown kind of brush. I use a lot of their, I think it's called, they're so used that you can't see the, there we go. So it's their Classico. What would you call it? Model brand. The other brush that I use by them is, this is also in a Skoda. This is their Modernista brush. So this is a, it's got a softer hair. It's a synthetic brush. The hog's hair are natural hair brush. I've also kind of started to use a few of Curry's brand stuff and a mix of Windsor Newton's brushes. I find Windsor Newton brushes, I don't know how to put this, bouncier. The way that they, I guess you'll find as an artist, different tools do different things for you, and some brushes have sort of a feel, like they spread paint in a way that makes sense for you more than others. And sometimes it shifts from brush to brush. Like sometimes you'll get a brush by one company and it's not necessarily always going to be as good as another brush by the same company. So again, a lot of my brushes are a Skoda. I mix them up with some Curry's brand brushes, a mix of synthetic and natural bristle for oil painting. Curry's has, I've been enjoying their synthetic brushes as well. So I'll get into this in a minute about what the properties and differences are between them. Trying to find there. So this is a Windsor Newton round. It's been with me for a long time. It's starting to get a little stiff, but it's a good color. So the medium I've got here is not my usual. This is a bit of linseed oil, a bit of Damar varnish, and a bit of Kama's turpentine. You can't use this stuff in schools because of the odor-free policies. But in my studio, I prefer to work with turpentine-based media. I don't have any of the allergies. I haven't developed any of those sort of allergies. One of the things I make sure in my studio is I've got a ventilation fan above where I work. So there's a constant airflow as I'm working. I'm not going to have it on while I'm doing the tutorial because it's loud, but usually I'll have that on. So far, so good. My lungs are good. Okay, so I typically work on the wall. I don't have a giant studio. It's a small space, but it works. So I've recently been stretching my own canvases. I'll show you how I put them together. But using I have a table saw and a miter saw. I can rig the miter saw up to hack off, sort of gouge halfway into the cross braces so that they fit together nicely. I've got a little nail gun. I bought an air compressor and a nail gun on sale for about $100, so that really speeds up my my building time. I usually pre-cut my wood, so I have a bunch of pre-cut wood in the studio ready to go when I need more paintings. Often I'll kind of have 4 or 5 paintings stretched and ready, and kind of just keep that rolling through the studio. Yeah, so basically just I usually buy 1x6s or 1x8s, slice them down to about 2 inches. One of them probably more like 1.5, I guess, inches. I bevel the inside edge, bevel the inside edge here. Using the table saw, I angle the blade, and that way I don't get any of these weird sort of brush shadows that you get from some purchased canvases. All right. So let's talk about transparency and opacity for a minute. So this again is my titanium white. So I'm just spreading it out so you can see what it does compared to the Zinc White. So you can maybe make it out, hopefully you can, how thin and translucent this white is compared to this. It's also a little bit warmer. So again, this is zinc, this is titanium. I'm going to mix them with cadmium orange so you can see the difference between the two. So titanium mixed with cad orange. And the zinc mixed with cadmium orange. So I have to mix a lot more of the zinc into the cadmium orange to get a similar tone. But you can see how that orange keeps kind of coming through, while the titanium white turns it into a pastel right away. This maintains a bit more translucency or transparency. It sort of spreads the color out. So again, depending on what you want for an effect, if you want to go with a color that's sort of got an opaque sort of pastel tint versus something that's a little more translucent, so you can see more of the underpainting kind of showing through. But let's see what it does with a translucent color next. So this was a cadmium orange. I'll show you what that does with the Windsor Orange. So that's titanium with a Windsor Orange. You can see that it's a much redder orange when mixed. And this is a Windsor Orange with the Zinc White. Let's see how they spread. Do you remember? So in the earlier classes, I had this as a demo. So let's see what. So this is cadmium orange with the titanium. So even though I've mixed it with some medium, it still goes on strong and opaque. You can't see a lot of the underpainting here, right? If you spread it sort of into the painting beneath. It gives you a cloudy, cool effect, kind of milky, right? So again, that's cadmium with the titanium. A note about your using medium, try to not overdo it, right? So see how far you can get with the paint on its own. If you overdo the medium, you get drips, you kind of start to lose control of it. The surface can become more brittle, and you lose the pigment loading as well. So this is the cadmium orange with zinc white. And I put it sort of right beside it. So I don't know if it comes across on screen, but it's definitely warmer. And you can definitely see more of the underpainting happening. But still milky because we've got white in there, right? This is the Windsor Orange with zinc. So it's much weaker in terms of the direct application. You can see a lot more of the underpainting right away. I don't have to spread it too thin before you start to see that effect. How about we talk about spreading the paint out a bit? When I get into glazing and applying subsequent layers, I like to use a bigger brush, like one of my like 1-inch brushes, something that's a little softer to start to spread the paint around. So this is my Curry's brush. It's nice and soft, so you're going to get a lot of bristle kind of action. So if you're trying to go for a smooth kind of application of a glaze, you can apply the paint and then start kind of brushing it around to get a smooth layer, a smooth glaze. I shift the direction of the brush. Like if I'm trying to go with a soft, smooth sort of blend. Okay. You want to see what would happen? Let's compare an application of cadmium orange and just so you can see the difference between opacity and translucency. So cadmium orange, I mixed it with my medium, so it's a little bit liquid. I don't want it too liquid though. I'll have a little bit of tooth and substance to the paint. There we go. So a cadmium red, or orange, sorry, cadmium orange, thinned out. You can see how it's got really good coverage. You can barely see what's underneath it, right? That was painted with a flat brush, by the way. I'll get into brushes in a minute. So this is the Windsor Orange. So I'll try to get it sort of to the same consistency. Where did my tube go? There it is. So this is about the same, with the same amount of medium in it. So you can see how, you can see the gray underneath, right? The underpainting through those strokes because of the translucency of the paint. So that means when you see that, you know this is a glaze friendly color. Okay, so this is a color that's good for a glaze application. So you might use cadmium as in sort of underpainting or for direct painting. This is great for warming up areas. So let's say my pears here are looking a little green and I wanted to warm them up. So I could use just this pure orange. Add a little bit of color and then spread it. As a glaze into the underpainting to start to warm that up. And some of the shading I've done in there already is not disappearing, right? You can still see some of the work I've done. It flattens it out a little bit. But a lot of that underpainting still shows through. So something I notice, like when I'm doing that glaze and starting to pull that orange over the lighter part of the pear, I'm starting to get this sort of peachy tone, which I don't really want. I want there to be sort of a gradual warming up from orange into sort of a yellow. So what I can do about that is add a little bit of my translucent Indian yellow into that mix. So you can see how that's a much warmer tone. And gradually integrate like a little touch of cadmium yellow light, as well as the Indian yellow. And then get that all nice and blended so you don't have awkward sort of transitions. And that would be sort of one layer of that glaze using the translucency of Indian yellow and the Windsor Orange. So there's easy ways to test. Like, it's good to have a painting like this that you can just test stuff out on and try things out. Like, what would happen if, you know, so let's do a similar comparison. So the cadmium orange, this is cadmium red going on. So you can see again, cadmium red has a very strong value. Like, it's very intense. The tinting is very intense, leading towards that orange, but it also, the coverage is really strong. It's opaque. We'll compare that to like Winsor Newton's bright orange. It's a little bit more of a translucent red. It's still a bright red. It's very close to cadmium middle. Here, I'll show you cadmium middle, which is also an opaque color. You can see that's a deeper red, but still goes on flat, opaque. Compare that to Windsor red, which has a bit of translucency. Again, you can see the grays poking through, right? You can see how that underpainting is still shimmering through the brush strokes. Not totally translucent, but it has some translucency. So that tells me it'd be okay for glazing. So if we wanted to turn an area of this really red, give it sort of a blush. Windsor red will do the trick for you. If you don't have something like that, like if you don't have Windsor red, that specific tone, on alizarin crimson is a similar color. It's a little bit more towards purple, but it has the translucency you'd want for a glaze. So again, this is I think this is my carmine red. You can see how transparent that is on the palette, right? You can see what's happening underneath it, like stained glass. You see what I mean? It tends towards a purple. It's a cooler red. But you could tone that down with an Indian yellow if you wanted to kind of have a nice kind of orange glaze. And use the brush to remove paint as well as apply it. Just to show you what that'll do over a blue. So again, this is basically a alizarin crimson or carmine red, similar colors. You want to make sure your brush is clear of other tones when you're doing these kinds of glazes. I'm going to switch to another 1-inch brush to do this. So if you wanted to transform this blue sort of tablecloth to purple, an alizarin crimson or carmine red, like a thin glaze of it, basically like a thin veil of color over the painting, can basically transform the tint, right? If I tried doing that with, let's say, cadmium red middle, the result should be something that's not as nice to look at. It'll be kind of like a brownish kind of tone, and you can see how, like, even as I'm spreading it, it has a chalky kind of look. Okay, so an opaque color will kind of float on top of the underpainting and have that sort of chalky appearance, while translucent glaze friendly color will almost dissolve into the painting, into the underpainting. So those are the warm tones. Let's move into some of the cooler colors now. Running out of room on my palette. We'll save that for later. Okay, this is a color you can no longer find. I'm going to show it to you because it used to be, I'm trying to preserve it. So it's a Viridian green. You can get Viridian hues still, but Viridian green has a really beautiful, translucent, cool emerald kind of look to it. Just to show you how it behaves on a painting. A really lovely color for glazing. It's close in tone to the phthalo greens, but the phthalo greens, as you'll see in a second, have a real kind of electric kind of energy to them that has sort of this artificial appearance. So you can see how lovely that is. That would be for like a glazing. So to kind of achieve like a green tint into an underpainting, really, really nice. A really weak color though, you know, it just about disappears. But you can use that. Phthalo greens are what I've kind of resorted to as my primary greens. I hardly ever use them straight out of the tube though, because they're so strong. So that's a phthalo green and a yellow. It's called phthalo green yellow, which is just a yellower tint. It's the same pigment. It's just prepared differently so that it tends towards the yellow side of the spectrum. So you can see how the phthalos, I don't know if you can see that, but there's a real intensity to that. That color compared with Viridian. Mix it with white and you get this really intense kind of, like I say, it's an electric blue green tone. It's almost neon to my eye. Whereas with Viridian, you get sort of a smokier tone. Almost a gray. Phthalo green, the yellow version of it, just to show you a bit of the difference there. So this is phthalo green with the yellow tint of phthalo green. These are also translucent, but they're a stronger color than Viridian. So you can see they hold up. That's the yellow version of. So phthalos are good for glazing. You just have to be careful because they're really strong colors. So a little bit of those can go a long way for a glaze. Blues. Oh, before I get to blues, I forgot a couple of greens. My least favorite color, chromium, chromium oxide green. It's a very swampy color. And gold green. So my gold green is one of my favorite colors. Old Holland makes it. It's gorgeous. I'll show you what it can do in a minute. Chromium oxide green, on the other hand, is like I said, sort of very swampy tone, very opaque, right? So it just floats on top of everything. Sort of that army green, right? Super flat color. But it can be, it can be mixed with other colors to get some interesting results, right? You can liven it up by adding cadmium yellow light and start to get something that's really interesting, like more something like light falling on a leaf, that kind of a tone. Mix that chromium oxide green with white, and you could get sort of a I don't know, distant hills kind of a color, right? But again, very opaque, not a color you want to use as a glaze. That's an underpainting kind of a color. My friend gold green on the other side of the equation is a very translucent green, very warm. I'm not going to use that brush because it's way too much. I don't want it. So this gold green, add a little bit of medium to that, and you can see the translucency. And you can see how warm it is, right? I've used this color for glazing in this painting. So this area has glazes of gold green through it. I'll show you what that looks like. So pure out of the tube, it has that sort of almost like a brownish green gold tone, right? Now mix it with white. And it gives you this. Well, that's not a good example. I didn't put enough white in there. With titanium. On a blank canvas. That's what you get. Gold green. I use this color a lot for sort of livening up cooler green areas. Really nice tone. Now onto blues. So typically I have 4 blues going. Where's my 4th brew? There it is. Okay. This is cerulean blue. Genuine cerulean blue. So it's sort of a sky blue. So mixed with white, this is what a cerulean will give you. On its own, it's on the opaque side. It's sort of in the middle. It's tends towards green a little bit, but it's more of a true blue kind of color. The other color I use is cobalt, not cobalt hue, the real stuff, the expensive stuff, but it's worth it. Cobalt blue gives you more of a middle, like right in the middle of blue, basically. So, and sort of like a sky blue. See, it's a little cooler than the cerulean. So that's got a bit of white with it. Cobalt on its own, I'll run out of brushes. Has a bit of translucency. So it's not a terrible blue for glazing. You can get a little bit of the underpainting kind of coming through. So this provides, if you want an effect where you're sort of pushing colors back into space to create sort of a real sense of aerial perspective, you can use cobalt blue for that. It just pushes everything back. You lose a little bit of the value as well. So the difference between your whites, so that white and that gray, you can see how it gets minimized when I apply the blue over top of it. Third blue I have is my Phthalo Blue. Phthalo Blue tends towards the green side of the spectrum. It has a similar sort of electricity about it as Phthalo Green does. It's a very strong color, strong hue, but it can be glaze friendly. You can see how strong that goes on the painting. But when it's thinned out, you can get a good sense of the variation of light gray to dark gray. All of those values that I put into the painting still come through that Phthalo Blue. My last blue is Ultramarine. Ultramarine tends towards the purple side of the spectrum. So it's a cooler blue. And it's translucent, so it's a good glazing blue. Great for shadows. Okay. So Phthalo, very far on the green side of the blue spectrum. Ultramarine is far to the purple side of of blue. Okay. Finally, well, should we talk about browns, purples? What am I talking? So many colors, people. All right. Get rid of that. Ugh. I feel like this tube of chromium oxide green is going to last me years because I use it so little. It's just, nothing personal. Okay, to the purples. So, Dioxygen Violet. Just going to make some room on the palette. My poor tube of Dioxygen Violet. Just about done. Quinacridone Violet. And Ultramarine Violet are my three purples. I have a Mineral Violet too, from Windsor Newton. It's a very strange color. I'll show it to you too. Okay. So I'll start with Dioxygen Violet. A royal purple, very dark, strong hue, like a dominant hue, mixed with white. You get these really intense, cool purples. All right. It has some translucency, so it can be glaze friendly, but it's just so strong that you really need to thin it to get any of the underpainting showing through. Let's see how much I have to really move it around before it starts to show the underpainting. A really strong hue, but you can't get a sense of what's happening underneath, right? So often, the way that I use my Dioxygen Violet is I'll often sort of mix it with, I sometimes mix it with my my Indian Yellow to get really gorgeous brown tones that are like a burnt sienna almost, a little cooler though. So you can get these really rich brownish purple tones. Great for like shadows of trees, forest floors, that kind of thing. On the other side of the spectrum of strong hues versus sort of weaker hues. So this is the Mineral Violet by Stevenson. It's similar in its behavior to the Viridian green, in that it's a really weak color. It hardly stands up for itself. And it's got this really beautiful tone, this warm, reddish, like almost crimson kind of violet purple. But it hardly can stand up on its own 2 feet compared to any of the underpainting. Okay, so it's good for a glaze if you wanted to tint something, right? So you can see how this little passage of yellow ochre underneath, how it warms that up and turns it into a almost a burnt sienna kind of a tone, right? But it's very pale, like very weak, really subtle color. The Ultramarine Violet by Windsor Newton is this one here. So the hue of it is similar to the dioxazine. It's more of a tending toward an ultramarine blue tone, right? But it's also not the strongest hue. Like it's also got it's a similar kind of weak tone. So if you spread it around, I didn't really add any medium to that. So just mixed with some of my medium, right? Painted over a gray underpainting. You can see it sort of gives this really nice thin, translucent violet tint to it, but not nearly as strong as dioxazine. I quite like that color. Again, for shadows, for areas of shadow into a painting, you could apply like a thin glaze of that over like a whole section of a painting to push it back, to deepen it, to tone it down a bit. And the final sort of purple tone is quinacridone violet, which is this one, which very getting close to alizarin crimson, but nice for glazing. Similar to dioxazine in that it's a really strong color. You can see it's got a strong voice over top of all of that underpainting. It doesn't mind showing off. But when it's spread out a bit, some of the underpainting can show through. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what the individual colors can do. I'm just going to show you a few, just the last few are some of the browns to give you a sense of what those tubes of paint are capable of. Transparent Red Oxide by Stevenson is similar to Windsor Newton's burnt sienna. They behave almost identically. I think the red oxide is slightly lighter, but they both have a translucent properties. So I often mix this color with ultramarine blue to give me a dark shadow if I'm doing glazing kind of processes. Get rid of that orange. So this is, again, that's red oxide, transparent red oxide. Got a lot of brushes to clean today after this session. So you can see that how nice and warm that is on its own. And translucent, a lovely color for warming an area up. As I said, I usually mix it with Ultramarine Blue. So you can get a really balanced, always a good place to add a shadow down here. So it gives you, instead of going with black, this gives you a translucent shadow. And you can alter the amount of brown or blue in that mix, depending on what you want to achieve. So you notice when I'm doing this sort of like really smooth glazing, I have one brush that I apply the color with, and then a brush that has nothing on it to kind of spread it around. So that's what I usually do for like a neutral kind of shadow. That mix of ultramarine and burnt sienna. Going on a little dirty, but okay. Raw umber. Is a neutral, kind of muddy brown. It's almost got a grayish tint to it. Different manufacturers, of course, are going to have slightly different properties. But when you're using artist quality, there's sort of a similarity amongst all of them. So this again is raw umber. Did I say raw umber? Burnt umber. I put it. Raw umber. So you can see you get a sort of smoky brown gray out of raw umber when mixed with white. On its own, it's a flat, kind of dark brown, a little on the cool side. Okay, so that's the raw umber. the other brown, and this is the last color I'm going to go over, is burnt umber. Which is a warmer, slightly lighter brown than its cousin. So there's more of a gray tint to the burnt umber. Or sorry, the raw umber. So burnt umber's got a little bit more energy to it when mixed with white. It does that versus burnt umber when mixed with white, you get that. So coming out of the tube, they don't look that different, but the second you start to add white to it, you get a really different, very different lighter browns. Okay, so that's kind of the tutorial demo part on the colors and what they do, their properties. You can review this on my YouTube channel. I'll keep this up if you want to kind of go through things, because that was a lot of colors, but that's sort of that's the palette that I kind of go accustomed to, depending on the painting. Like every painting has its own sort of, variety of colors that I'll use depending on the effects I'm trying to achieve. This painting is getting crazier and crazier as I work on it. Okay, brushes. So you can see I've already kind of given you an assortment of brushes through the color demo, but I have a wide range of brushes. So this is a 4-inch flat brush. So this brush you can kind of use as a squeegee. Right. Ideally, if you want like a really flat edge, you can get close, depending on how much medium you use and how good a shape the brush is in. This brush has been through a lot. But you can imagine if you wanted to kind of cover a large amount of space with a color, why use a little brush? Pick the right brush. Pick the brush that's going to sort of suit the job you want it to do. So I use the 4-inch brush in my larger pieces. You can see I've had big, thick gobs of paint where I'll squeeze like a tube out and pull that across the whole painting with a couple of pulls just to start to fill. So the idea for that was to kind of feel like almost like 2x4s or timber rough wood going across scraping across the surface of the painting. So I've used this brush to fill in large areas of the painting and to achieve a different kind of brush stroke as well. So in a large piece, like what I'm asking my painting students to do, right? If you can use a range from this to, this to this to this, all kind of within one painting, it gives you a bunch of different kinds of textures, a bunch of different marks that activate the surface, right? If the whole painting was done with one brush, this brush, or this brush, it's almost like one instrument playing in an orchestra, whereas when you start to kind of introduce a variety of brush types and brush sizes, you get those sort of different voices happening. So you can achieve that through color, through the kind of brush you're making, through the kind of textures you're adding. So that's a flat brush, flat 4-inch. This is a flat 1-inch brush, or a number 12. Again, this brush has kind of seen a lot of action, so it's not as flat as it used to be. But what a flat brush gives you is that more consistent edge, right? But you can also use it in a sort of, to make sort of a calligraphic mark. So I'm going to add a bunch of medium here. I'm going to fill an area out with just to show you like a wet and wet kind of technique. So the brush can achieve that flat mark, but when it's, you apply a bunch of paint to it, you get some gobs of paint onto it, right? You can achieve more variety in your mark, right? Depending on how you push and pull the paint around. Right, all these different marks can be applied using one brush. You can get a wide range of expression out of one brush. So that's just out of the 1-inch or number 12 brush. Round brushes like this, I think this is also a 12, maybe a 10 Skoda brush. Right, that's going to give you that. So if you want something that has sort of, you're able to kind of create clouds out of this, right? Like it's going to have more of an organic kind of a feel than the architectural mark that a flat brush is going to make, right? It's got a different start to that mark. But it has a nice range as well. I don't think it acts as, like, I'm not getting as precise a thin line as I am from the edge of that flat brush. But for something where you want something with soft edges, round edges, that sort of feel of maybe an organic or amorphous kind of form, round brush is a good way to go. The third option is the Filbert. Let's bring our orange back in here for a minute. So filbert is somewhere in between, right? It's got a beveled sort of round edge, but it's got a variety of dimension depending on how you look at it. So again, good for a more kind of organic, amorphous kind of start, but it gives you a really wide range of motion. Right. Again, thinking of the calligraphy that's possible with that brush. You can achieve a lot with it. So these are all hog's hair, natural sort of coarser hair brushes. But as I mentioned at the start of this, like 2 hours ago, this marathon of blabbing on and on and on about painting, is you've got this option of the nylon or synthetic brush. So I use these little brushes for really tight, detailed line. Usually really thin applications because the brush is so soft, right? It can't handle a big, like if I try to paint impasto with this brush, more of the paint sticks on the brush than goes onto the painting, right? So with the nylon brushes, I'm often using very liquid, very thinned paint applications to sort of achieve really fine kind of details. And there's a crispness to the line that you can achieve with these as well. The bristles are tighter, right? They stay tighter. So if I tried to do the same thing with one of my old hog's hair brushes, now you can see how the quality of the line is sort of lost a little bit. They're a little less predictable sometimes, the hog's hair. But you can hear the difference on the canvas too, right? So if you want something smooth and precise, really tight painting, really detail oriented, probably the synthetic brush is the way to go. If you're looking for something that's more gestural, more emotive, the more textured, the hog's hair bristle is the way to go. So you can play with that range, right? Like have a variety of brushes that are available to you and that you keep good care of. Make sure you wash them regularly. Don't leave them with paint on them overnight because that'll kill the bristles and you end up with brushes that look like mine. Like you can tell the brushes that I didn't take care of. See how it's sort of like, it's not happy. That was because of one of those sort of, oh, I'm going to go in the studio. Oh, darn, I've got to go pick up the kids now. And then getting busy with life and forgetting that you've got a brush loaded with paint. So this, which was one of my favorite brushes, is now very unpredictable, very difficult to use. Okay. There's also a difference between like a short or bright flat brush and a longer bristled brush. What a short or bright brush gives you is, again, like there's an architecture to this, right? Like it's a solid line that this brush is making. I'm pushing all the way down on it, so I'm getting a nice predictable edge on both sides of that brush. Okay, so that's a bright, flat brush. So you can see how tight that edge is compared to the hog's hair, which is a little bit less predictable, but a little bit more organic, right? So the difference, I'd say, is that with a bright, flat brush that's a synthetic bristle, I don't know, this is like architectural steel or aluminum, whereas a flat sort of bristled brush like that one is going to give you something that's more like a rough kind of wood. It's still architectural, it's still solid, it's still got that kind of that feeling, but it's a little less predictable, a little bit more on the natural side of things. So I think that's all I have to say today. I'll just leave this running for a bit so you can watch me paint. If you have questions, feel free to email me. Leave a note in on the YouTube. That pink was just too strong. So pink yellow. To disappear into that fire. Okay, I think it's lunchtime. I will clean my brushes, I promise.